Okay, go.
What if I just make noise now? If I just stop making my point, I just go, "Ah." Okay. I was making a point about, first off, okay. I was making a point about sublation that to me, I mean, like, I don't know, it's like at the very beginning, he opens up with the flower analogy, and he's very like repetitive in his point that it's like, okay, in a way, you have a seed and that grows into a sprout and then that grows into a thing with a bulb and that blossoms, right? So a flower is not a seed anymore necessarily. But if you were to look at it as just like the flower killed the seed and then the bloom killed the bud and the, like it's just this process of like a pure destruction of entities, that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate either. It's this part of the thing that is not necessarily the whole story anymore. It's this changing and this moving. And when he describes changing and moving, I think that just as like and I think this was where we're like, you guys are kind of coming from when you were saying like, or I mean, Eric, when when you were saying not to put my hood back on, no, when you were saying that it's like uh it's like he's very conscious of the contradictory and multifarious meanings of sublation or of Alchebung, and he's trying to play with that. To me, I read that as him. It's like it's like he's trying to actively do that in like even other Germans would have read this and been like, oh, he's getting kind of creative with that. He's using that word a little creatively. Okay. You know? And my point is that like I think he's trying to not only give it like a new sort of a new expression of what Aufhebung can be. Like he's trying to say like, hey everybody, look at what it can be, right? Like let's not totally disregard this as just some weird frou-frou academia word. This is kind of, it's kind of useful to talk about stuff. And then I think he's taking a step further and he's like, okay, once we accept that this weird contradictory idea of exaltation and destruction and preservation and stuff, once we kind of get used to that and it's not as jarring to the senses when you see it, he's like, okay, now we're in this crazy mental space where we can take that term and we can use it. We can not use it, we can find it. It's like we can find it in a lot of stuff, in a lot of places that we didn't think that we would find it. And so he's looking at these movements and these processes, and he's saying, like, this isn't just my consciousness killing itself or me growing up to be a better person day by day. I'm just becoming better and better and better, or something like this progressive development or whatever. It's like there's sublation going. So he's like, now that we've got this kind of new way of thinking of sublation, we can actually see that it's very useful, if not like kind of necessary, to talk about these things in this certain way, in this movement. And so he's on one hand, he's kind of expanding our sense of the word and he's using it a little liberally, I'll agree. But at the same time, he's saying like, once we've made that first step into this new zone outside of our comfort, um, we can find like a lot of utility for this term within this realm of contradiction. This contradictory term is very good, surprise, surprise, for describing contradictory processes. He's like pointing to a bunch of contradictions in our thinking, and he's like, he's like, yeah, I know the way I'm using sublation is contradictory, but I don't know what to tell you, dude. Like, is that not sublation? He's like, he would point to it and be like, is it not sublating it? Come on, you know. and like maybe I'm approaching the text, and this is something I thought about actually, and then I'm done talking. But I feel like a lot of the text I'm approaching in a way that I don't know if is the same as the way that you guys are approaching. I don't know if you guys and I, or maybe just I and certain other people that I've been reading and kind of inundated by, um, like inundated with the work of certain individuals who read Hegel in this way, where it's like on one hand, it's really serious, and it's reading Hegel to the point of like really radical pedantry of like every little punctuation mark is important, every single word is meaningful, and it's intentional, and it's almost like Kabbalah. It's like that. Like there's that sort of aspect to Hegel, and he is actively kind of endorsing that. He's saying like all of the content that's there is salient in some sense, like in a lot of places. Yes, Hegel in the Hermetic tradition. But on the other hand, the other aspect of that, the kind of contradictory aspect of reading him like Kabbalah, is like, and this is just something that I've read a bunch of places and that I guess I've kind of internalized in my introduction, because this is the firsthand Hegel that I've ever really sat down and worked through, like with you guys, and that is great. But like, it comes with this, it's like the people that I've read have made this point over and over, that it's like, not only, yes, do you take everything super seriously, but the only way to actually take everything super seriously is to include into your interpretation of the thing a non-serious interpretation. And into your thinking, not only do you say, okay, yes, this is all good, formal, functional logic. This is all functional, logical lines of reasoning, yes. But also opening oneself up to the idea that it could be an ironic statement, or a statement made from a very particular position of or shape of consciousness that is not at all something that we should take to heart within our day-to-day life or experience, you know, like, and then the next step is opening yourself up to the possibility that it could be both at the same time, that he could both be like being an ass kind of, and also trying to make a point. And I think, and I know this is silly, but like this section, like I got some big laughs. Like Hegel made me laugh really hard at certain parts, like where he's talking about, okay, so let's take the color and hardness. Okay, that's kind of, so this guy would say that's kind of similar to like a horse's responsiveness to the stimulus of oats. Does that make sense? He's like, it's like and maybe I'm just projecting and I'm making all this up and I'm totally lost. But to me, it just reads as if there are parts of it, not the whole thing, but there are parts of the reading where it's like he is belaboring a point intentionally. And it's like he is coming at it with this attitude of like, all right, folks, let's go through this as carefully and as slowly as you guys seem to want. Let's do it. Let's go through this. Let's make this happen. All right. You want like a thorough explanation or exploration of these ideas? Let's go as thorough as physically possible. Let's create a system. It's kind of like in the preface. To me, the preface read to me is like him saying like, okay, you read a typical philosophy text, like a lot of philosophy text, you can read it. Like, let's say I read Descartes' Meditations or something, right? And then I go on a date or I'm talking to my friends or whatever, and they say, what you been reading? And I'd say, oh, it's Descartes' Meditations. And they'd say, oh, what's that about? And then I just read it, right? And it's maybe 100 pages. And I would have like a series of points where I'm like, well, as far as I know, it's about this, which then turns into this, and then this, and then this. And then it culminates in this kind of final conclusion point. And it's really cool. And they'd be like, oh, wow, that's so interesting. What a nice edifice. I love those. I love edification. But Hegel was like, I'm going to make a book where it is impossible to do that. I'm going to make a project of analysis where it is like, if you think that you are going to like memorize the contents of this book, you are an insane person. Like that's like out the window, like at the outset of the project. But at the same time, it's carried with this like Hermetic tradition spirit of Kabbalah, of like hidden meaning. And the place that I find myself in when I face those two ends of like, it's like not even Hegel, even though Hegel was kind of nutty in a lot of places. not even he, I think, would be like, oh, you read through the book once? Yeah, so you memorized it, right? You have kind of every single line of like, every paragraph's worth of twists and turns in the logic. That's all memorized and ready to be spat back out and explained to like a fifth grader, right? He would be like, no, that's not necessarily possible. Yes, I know. Zizek seems to have memorized it. He's also kind of a nut. Um, but like, but like when you have to combine that spirit, or when you have to reconcile that spirit of the impossibility of totally symbolically integrating every last detail of a project into your being, when you have to cope with that and reconcile that with the insistence on formality and on rigor and attention and effort, to me it reconciles in a non-reconciliation, in a dual reading, in this ever-present sort of game. It's like, it's sort of like a metaphor or a joke almost, that should be taken completely literally at the same time. It's just a really wild attempt or exploration of what you can do with theory. It's this really experimental approach, I think, to the realm of theory and reading theory in this way. And I just think it's like boundlessly interesting. I could read it once right now, my first reading. I could read it as like kind of a neophyte. I'm kind of young and afraid of difficult theory. And then I read it a second time as like one big farce, as like a comedy. I could read the whole book again as like this big ironic lampooning of theory or of unity and idealism. And then the next time I read it, I'm so familiar with it that I can really kind of roll out every little detail onto a flat sort of understanding of my experience of the book. And one might say, oh, well, then that's where you have sort of the most complete understanding. But I think Hegel would say, no, that's where you risk. Once you're that familiar, it's like that's where you're most at risk of the ideas going cold and becoming like a cadaver. But it's the life, it's the energy, it's the movement, it's the organic enterprise as a whole that has meaning. It all has meaning. It shouldn't be thrown away. You shouldn't stop yourself from trying to understand a text, but you shouldn't see one as necessary and the other one as just a contingent little roadblock on your way to success. You know what I mean? Does that make sense at all? By the way, also, this is just an aside, but I'm dealing with like some severe paranoia recently, and it's not paranoia in the sense that I think the CIA is going to kill me or something, but paranoia in the sense that like I've been feeling lately like pretty much everything I say is pretty much incomprehensible. Like I have been recently faced with that like multiple times. I went on this really terrible date the other day. It was like, I don't know, maybe that's it. I'm really kind of facing like the idea that it might be possible that I don't actually have some point to make. And I'm just kind of going. And like other people, I'm just telling them, I'm lying to them and I'm assuring them, don't worry, I have some sort of point to make. Please believe me. And then I finish talking and they don't understand what I mean. And then I can kind of hide behind this veil of like, you didn't understand it because it's too difficult. And then I kind of disappear into the shadows.
Was this the same coffee date that you had where you explained that you were reading Ulysses and they were like, is that the book of the biography of the president or whatever?
Yes. And then
okay, same one, yeah.
I had another coffee date a week later that went very similarly, except that time all we talked about was that John McAfee died. And I was really
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was really fucked up about that. It happened like 2 days ago. And I was like, did you hear John McAfee died? That was one of the first things I said to this woman. And she was like, who? And then I was like, oh, dude, it's that my grandma believes in QAnon. And like she talks to me about these lizards that enslaved us and we mined gold. And and she looked like she had somewhere else to be. which, but so maybe that's kind of fueling my doubts, but I don't know.
You know what? I think there needs to be a Hegelian dating website. That's
You and
I
me
mean, just
both.
think about the profiles on that. Yeah.
They look for your opposite and then try to make a coincidence of opposites. Like, you guys are just complete opposites. There is no way you can even like hold a civil conversation between the two of you. You'll make a good match. It'll sublate into something even more awesome.
Well, I'm going to take Hunter's and the rest of your comments, even if you're saying, I don't know what I'm talking about, and this is all garbage, and this is all farce. I'm going to take what you're saying at face value and still be serious. What jumped out at me is, and I didn't finish it, I apologize, but when Hegel is talking about the master and servant relationship, what I thought was interesting is, and I only got up to page 121, but he only mentioned, he only used the word sublate once. And I just thought it was interesting that if sublation is one definition I had was, the assimilation of a smaller entity into a larger one. He only used sublate once in talking about the master-servant relationship, where before he was writing about that, he was using that term constantly. I don't know. I mean, given the situation that Hegel found himself in when he started to compose this, I don't think it was a lark. I don't think it was a joke. I don't think he anticipated Monty Python's Flying Circus by 160 some years. My understanding about German philosophy or German philosophers is there's a conceit that if it's serious, then it has to be difficult. And so when, I don't remember who wrote, if it was Chase, that people who wrote philosophy in German who were German nationalities were perfectly capable of writing in more understandable German, but that went against what they thought how philosophy had to be presented. Right. It was more than aesthetics. Even though maybe aesthetics is a part of it, but if one was going to get deeper into a philosophical subject, it by definition had to be difficult, which is very different from the Anglo tradition in philosophy. Or think of John Locke compared to Hegel, for example. So
I had my one German class, the instructor said something very similar. She said in a German intellectual culture, at least in the past, there's this sort of intellectual machismo, and they enjoyed, because German is partially inflected. You can build these nested sentence structures, where you've got like subject object, and so on, and then you have to it takes a certain amount of effort just to unpack the sentences, and that some of the German philosophers intentionally leverage that structure to create complex sentences and paragraphs, not only because the ideas were complex, but because it exhibited their intellectual prowess, and it required a certain amount of effort from the reader to also exhibit, I have the intellectual strength to decode this difficult language. And so, like what my dissertation advisor said, that the French existentialists learned to write from the Germans, which is why Sartre sounds like he does, because he was reading Hegel and those Heidegger and those guys. But anyway, she made a similar comment. Then you have some people like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer who kind of run against that trend and write more clearly. Like, for example, Heidegger, being in time is really tortuous. Part of the reason is because I think and I'm sure this is partially true with Hegel as well. He is truly trying to explain new ideas for which there is no vocabulary. And so that, that's in a an authentic part of the problem. But I've read other stuff by Hegel, like I've got The Basic Problems of Phenomenology. It's one of the clearest things, I'm sorry, by Heidegger. It's one of the clearest things I've ever read in my life. It's great, just extremely clear and easy to understand. So, and then, I don't know, you hear the stories about the phenomenology being written while while the army was at the doors of the city trying to break in. And so he's, all sorts of stuff is causing it to be complex.
Yeah, I might be showing my bias here, but I mean, I feel like a lot like Heidegger, Hegel is trying to, in his mind, express new ideas that haven't really been expressed, or a collage, like put together a collage of ideas that have, somewhat been expressed in the past, but the form of this overall collage is itself new. And so he has to just kind of like present it in a way that, that does justice to the nuance and sophistication of his perspective. I'm sure all of us have been in the position where you say what you mean and then people mistake what you say what you mean. So you say it again, but maybe a little bit longer. Maybe you add a clause or a phrase to allay that confusion. And then they just come back at you with another confusion, maybe an opposite confusion. And you're like, okay, neither this nor that, but this, but not always, only in a specific way. And so like the more you have to qualify your statements and the more you really just want to be accurate that what you say is what you mean, no more, no less, the more careful you're going to be in how you present your ideas. And so I think that's a part of it, like the subject matter. There are times where I read Hegel and I think I've got it. How would I say it differently? Actually, I don't know that I could say it very differently. I might change some of the, like the terms, like there's a lot of reliance on the in itself, for itself, in and for itself, and these kinds of, all these prepositions that come up, and it's easy to get lost in the preposition. So I would try to like maybe think of ways to, but, to cut through the jungle of prepositions. But I think a lot of times it's thinking of a better way to say what he means, and exactly what he means, no more, no less, is a challenge. When I read Adorno, I find it, especially when I first started reading Adorno, I find it really a challenge. But nearly all the time, once I've grasped what he's trying to say, I love the way he said it. Even though on the first reading, it was difficult. After I get it, I think there's no better way to say it, and he had to say it in this difficult way because he means this and not this. He doesn't want to be confused or mistaken for meaning something he doesn't mean. So he's being very precise in his language. I do want to say, though, it does seem to me like it sometimes the later French late 20th century took on the culture of obscurantism for obscurantism's sake. Like, I'm going to be difficult to read because if it's easy to read, nobody will respect me. Whereas if I make it very difficult to read, then I'm in that position that Hunter finished with there. Oh, you can't understand me because you haven't done the rest necessary work to you're just not smart enough to understand my language. So I think there's there's a little bit of a fail-safe in making things a little bit more obscure than they have to be, because you can just kind of fall back on, well, you just don't get it because you're not as smart as me. I'm not saying that's all. I'm not saying that's French philosophy at large. Like I do like Derrida. I do like Foucault. But there are moments. I want to say more so with Judith Butler to a certain extent, and Deleuze. I think, do you want to be understood, or are you just trying to sound smart?
Just to kind of keep that going, because I actually, there were a couple things that you said. I'm writing them down as I'm saying this to stall so I can write them down so I can remember my points. But it's just to, first, I think like, Nevitt made a good point in the text, in the chat. He said, like, Eric, it's like the way that you're describing that is pretty similar to some conversations that Nevitt and I have had. And I think the point that I've tried to get across in those conversations, and I think you are, at least what I'm relating it to in my mind, the point that you're getting across is that, like, it's like you read you read somebody like Camus, and he is just laden with poetry and imagery and beautiful metaphors and and there's literally a part in the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus where he's like, Kierkegaard was the Don Juan of the understanding, doing pirouettes in the dark, wrestling with a thorn that was always in his heart. And I was like, okay. At the time, it was impactful and it was emotionally connecting with me and I liked it a lot. But then I reread it recently and I was kind of like, okay. It's like, all right, that's cool. What does that mean? And it's like, this is a point that I guess I try to kind of make in my general life. And it's that like, I think people look at really dense theoretical writing like this and are like, those people are being unnecessarily obtuse and they should just kind of chill out. And like I've said before, smoke a doober, write a little easier, be a little bit, open up a space. I actually had this conversation with my friend today in a group chat that I was in because Travis made some point in the group chat. He said, I just hate how we were talking about STEM majors, and he said classifying people by their majors is so stupid and overly analytical. And I said, all particular categories are species of the genus of the pure category, Travis. And I just said that. And then my other friend in the group chat was like, stop talking like this. You're intentionally being obtuse. And I was like, hear me out here. He said, you should open up with easier language in order to get to the more difficult stuff. And my point in response was, listen, I would do that if I were like giving a lecture, but I'm in a group chat right now and I'm eating a Hot Pocket and I don't really care. And I know that everybody in this group chat is not going to approach my dense theoretical hoo-ha with good faith necessarily. And so if I write a simple answer and then the difficult shit later, everybody's just going to read the simple answer and then maybe look at what I'm writing later. But if I write the hard stuff first and then I'm like, okay, here's what that means, I will then have tricked them into reading something good for them. They will have unwittingly read something difficult because they didn't expect it. And I was like, but my point is, if we want to talk, and I'm going to kind of, speaking of Travis, I'm going to kind of channel his energy here and talk about emotions and feelings. And I feel like my relationship to dense theoretical writing has kind of morphed and changed over the years, but it's been in this place where it's like, to me, Hegel's dense German sentence structure and his long-winded explanations of ideas and all this, his really thorough analyses and stuff, to me at this point, and again, maybe this is because I've lost my marbles, but like, yeah, it's always a possibility. It's always a possibility, but it's like, that to me is like, it's way closer to this center of what he's feeling than I think he could have gotten if he tried to make it palpable and beautiful and intentionally alluring. It's like the dense theory is him just being honest about what he's thinking. He's not going out of his way to make it more obtuse. He would have to go out of his, and this is, I don't know if this is true. This is just a blanket statement that I'm making about theory in general. And I'm saying it's as if this is the case. I'm not saying this is the case. It's as if it's like his, and my honest feelings relate to this. It's like his honest feelings are expressed through this bizarre realm of jargon and rules and formalities, rather than trying to kind of soften them up and sugarcoat them in order to get people interested in them and be willing to listen to what he has to say. To me, it's like, this is more emotional and heartfelt and tear-jerking at certain points than like, I think more poetic approaches can be at times. This is not a hard and fast rule in any way, but it's just, this opens up a whole new realm of interesting approaches to emotions and to feelings and readings of text and the experience of the reader with the experience of the writer. But then just my second point, which is just like a throwaway, this is mostly like a funny, Zizek was talking about Judith Butler, and he made a point. he said, I don't necessarily write in as complex of a way as Hegel did. And he says, but I think this is founded on a thing where people, ever since I was growing, he said this, he was like, ever since I was growing up, I remember hearing this phrase a lot, who believes anymore? Who believes in anything anymore? You know, and nobody believes in things like love and whatever, right? The ancients were the ones who just really loved, and we see love as this abstract and mechanical category. And then he said, okay, let me take a contemporary and a good friend of mine, Judith Butler. And he says, I have a bottle of tea here on this podium that I've been drinking while talking to you. And if I were Judith Butler, I would say, if we can all simultaneously, in an intersubjective, practical way, agree on the terms of the language game that would orient a differential symbolic order around this bottle of tea such that it is a bottle of tea, I could say that this is a bottle of tea. And he's like, or I could say this is a bottle of tea. These are not the same thing. These are not the same statement. And he says, but the point I'm trying to make is that we are the ones who really believe. We are afraid to say, I love you, because instead of saying, I love you, it's too powerful, it's too meaningful, it's too dire. Instead, I'm going to say, I have this complex web of emotions for you, and I feel this boundless metaphysical passion in my spirit for you, and whatever. And he's like, all this expansion and building upon this thing, it's we who believe so much in it. It's so, we believe in it so much that it is frightening, and we try to distance ourselves from it and speak about it in this weird way. Even though it is true that the ancients would say, just, I love you, you know, but that doesn't make what they're saying like simpler or you know, less developed of an idea to say, I love you, you know. But yeah.
Yeah, I like that very last point there. It reminds me of Anthony Burgess in A Clockwork Orange. So he wrote this preface or introduction quite a while afterwards, and was kind of reflecting on it and said, okay, so for those who don't know, Clockwork Orange, so Anthony Burgess is a kind of linguist, I think. And basically I think he wrote a book also on Joyce, I think maybe specifically on Finnegan's Wake, possibly. So just to let you know, that's kind of the territory he's in. And A Clockwork Orange is written in a kind of, it's called Nadzat, which is Russian for teens or something like that. It's a kind of mix of corrupted Russian and kind of London slang, Cockney slang. And he was reflecting on it, like, why did I write the book like this? You know, what was I thinking? He thought that it was somewhat of a cowardly thing to do, because he was kind of trying to hide basically from his own insights or what he was trying to express. To kind of water it down, he thought that he was giving it this new language, literally a new language, to try to express it, to kind of, you know, mediate it in some sense, because it was too disturbing, too frightening for himself. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And you know, that gets into maybe some interesting unconscious kind of mechanisms or whatnot that go on with the writer trying to, you know, express their own insights. And, you know, where does that come from? You know, that whole process. But yeah, I think, you know, in terms of just all the stuff that's been said about, you know, philosophy and the style of philosophy in German and the French and whatnot, I mean, I agree basically with what everyone was saying. I definitely don't think that, well, I think we're all familiar with this kind of narrative that you'll see in like YouTube comments or whatnot, that if you don't understand something, I remember specifically. There's a, I think it was an Onion video that was talking about this guy was a construction worker, some like real blue collar, but then he read intersectional queer studies, feminist theory, and Judith Butler, and then just totally changed his mind. And one of the joke things was that they showed a quote from Judith Butler that, you know, is in that language that sounds all phenomenological kind of. And the joke was supposed to be the like, what the hell does this mean, you know? But coming from some blue collar construction worker guy, making him realize, you know, about systemic racism or something like that. But in the comments, people put the quote and they're like, this means absolutely nothing. And it's that kind of thing. And I looked at the quote and it's like, okay, it's kind of hard to figure out, but it's really not that hard to figure out. Basically, it just takes a little bit of work, but there's this kind of tendency for people to look at it, not get it, it looks confusing, and then to say it means nothing. And also there's the person personally, the writer consciously knows they have nothing to say, so they're just using empty words to sound smart. And then usually that kind of expands into an institutional conspiracy where academia as such is this kind of conspiracy to do exactly that. Basically construct you know, conglomerations of words that don't actually have any meaning, but everyone will pretend like they do. So that seems to be what I would say probably half the population probably thinks that, I would say. So I think that's an interesting meaning in itself for what the style of philosophy and how people kind of respond to that. You know, how do philosophers respond to that, knowing that there's this backdrop of that, while meanwhile they have their own colleagues, these professional philosophers who are engaged in this very complex debate among themselves, and that's usually who they're speaking to, is, you know, professional philosophers. And if you, okay, I can't open up Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead's Principia Mathematica and just look at it. Oh yeah, I get that. Oh yeah, that symbol, totally. Oh, I don't know about that point. I think, yeah, maybe go over that one again. But no, I have to learn mathematics. I have to learn symbolic logic in order to even start trying to understand it. But I think because what philosophy does is so widespread, or Hegel was universal, people think that they can do it. They think they can point at things and know reality or whatnot. But the thing is, so people have this belief they can do that, where of course they understand, okay, I can't open up, you know, quantum physics or some book on quantum physics and understand what's going on, you know, but they're not going to say that doesn't mean anything, most people at least. But then they don't extend that to philosophy, even though it's pretty similar. There's, you know, of course, technical jargon and whatnot, but it's kind of ridiculous for people to expect, you know, some person off the street to open up Heidegger and just start understanding it in this extremely clear manner, as if, and some people believe there's also a kind of normative thing where it's basically unethical to not make it where someone with you know, like an 8th grade reading level can open up a book and just understand it just as clear as possible. So and I think that's the kind of thing in the Anglo-American ideas, that there's a normative pressure to make it extremely simple so that everyone can understand it. But then I think there's definitely a limit to thought that comes with that simplicity. It's very, very difficult to be able to really say anything with complex articulations and determinacies and whatnot by speaking and writing in a, an 8th grade level, or what's like the common newspaper. I think it's like 6th grade or something, 8th grade. Yeah. But if you read analytic philosophy, there is some pretty complex stuff there. And honestly, those are the best analytic philosophy, in my opinion, is the stuff that actually is pretty complex. But a lot of it is this really clear, simple writing. It's just, so clear. And it never says anything profound at all. It just kind of reiterates just common understandings of things and never really goes anywhere. And it just bores me. Yeah, I need something that challenges me. I don't know, personally. But yeah, that's my thoughts on that, which turned into a rant. I was gonna just talk a little bit about it. I have some other points. Okay, yeah, I'll just get into this real quick. Okay, about the reading itself, I thought the reading we covered, I thought was really interesting. I liked it a lot. So I liked the reading from last time a lot too, especially the part about the skeptical consciousness, and the part that I could understand about the unhappy consciousness. But this part I thought had some really, really amazing sections, especially towards the end, where Hegel kind of articulates a process philosophy in a very clear manner. I thought that was really interesting. A basic kind of process relational philosophy. If somebody wants, to understand what that means, those last kind of paragraphs or whatnot were a really good example of that. And also, I thought it was interesting how so this connects, I thought, with Bergson a lot. It reminded me a lot of Bergson in that he was critiquing mathematics in that quantitative way of trying to understand these things. And also that there's a kind of vitalism to it, where you're saying that, the organic is this fluid thing that kind of escapes determinations and, always supersedes them and whatnot. So I thought that part was really interesting. So I'm just going to say that. And yeah.
Can I add to what Chase just said at the end? On page 161, paragraph 275, the last couple of sentences just really jumped out at me when I was reading it. For the determinists of their sensuous being consists just in their existing in complete indifference to each other and exhibiting the freedom of nature unbound from the concept, instead of exhibiting the unity of a relation. It exhibits not so much these moments themselves as it does nature's irrational playing up and down the scale of contingent magnitudes which lie between the moments of the concept. I thought that what he was saying is we have to be careful anytime we use a concept, because there's always going to be specificity of specific entities that are covered by that concept. And so, to use a mundane example, we use the word dog all the time, but obviously a Chihuahua and a German Shepherd are very different, right? And I think he's cautioning that, especially when we're looking at organic entities, we have to be very careful of over generalizing from the concepts. But I didn't know if anybody else, if that part of the paragraph jumped out at anybody else.
Just in response, that's actually sorry, just really quick. It's really quick. that part that you just quoted was right up below the part that was like one of the parts that made me laugh. He says like these differences can as easily be observed as it can be observed that one body is harder than another, and so on. If consideration is taken of such sensuous properties such as hardness and color, etc., as well as the phenomena of responsiveness to the stimulus of oats, of irritability for burdens, or of the number and kind of young that can be born, then when they are related to and compared with each other, they essentially stand in conflict with any kind of lawfulness. So like, yeah, I'm with you. He's like, I think that is kind of like, that was, I mean, we kind of stopped in the middle of the section, so I don't know where he's going with these ideas, but that was just another point that he was making where it's like, don't get too into the magnitude. Don't focus too hard on the magnitude or on like the purely conceptual. The purely conceptual or the purely existent, they run into problems if you get too wedded to one or the other and you start doing weird, silly things, like thinking about the hardness of a rock as the same as like when a horse likes oats. And he's like, it's really not the same. But because what if the horse doesn't like oats? But yeah, okay, anyway, that's, yeah.
I have some really big questions. Like, he seems like he's kind of sneaking up onto the real is the rational is the real in the beginning of this section. And I have big questions about that, and also about the relationship between observing consciousness and reason, and also what the hell is nature. But because I don't really understand any of that stuff, I'm gonna make a comment about something I think maybe I understood a little bit. You know, one of the things that surprised me in here was when he, for a bunch of pages, he was talking about the instinctive reason. And that really confused me because, you know, in most of the tradition, reason and instinct are kind of opposed. And in fact, you know, like in the grounding for the metaphysics of morals, Kant says, whoa, sorry, the vodka is beginning to kick in. I'm having a little head fuzziness here. But the Kant says, you can either follow your instincts and become happy, or you can follow reason and do the right thing, but they obviously go in opposite directions. And so this business about the instinct of reason I found really confusing. But here's my theory. This is just, you know, what kind of what I wonder if he's doing here. I wonder if he's responding to Hume to some degree. So, you know, Hume said, for example, because there's places in this passages, in the passages we read for this week where he's directly or indirectly talking about things like cause and effect and natural laws and that kind of thing. And, you know, so Hume famously said, there is no reason to believe in cause and effect. Cause and effect is, we believe in it because of an instinct. In other words, we have an instinctive tendency to believe that constant conjunction, or what he called constant conjunction, is causation. But there's no reason to believe that if this happens and then this happens, this happens and this happens, this happens and this happens a million times, reason can't tell you that the one's the cause and the other's the effect. And the belief in that is what's happening is just an instinct. It's an instinctive tendency. And you see the same instinctive tendency in animals across the spectrum, from the simplest organism into the most complex. So, you know, obviously dogs and cats have a sort of grasp of cause and effect, but it's not based on reasoning, because they don't reason very well. And even simple organisms have a, you know, basic sense of cause and effect, because, you know, simple organisms know that they need to, quote, they need to go to pursue food in a certain kind of way. And so there's these basic instinctive causal mechanisms built into the biology. And I think Darwin would explain this in terms of evolution. And, you know, so Hume says, our belief in these natural laws, especially cause and effect, is really instinctive. He explicitly says it is not rational. I mean, he's very, very clear about this. Reason has nothing to do with this. And so what I'm wondering if what Hegel's doing when he's talking about instinctive reason is addressing exactly that point and saying, Hume, you're wrong. There is something like an instinctive reason that is kind of a precognitive reasoning that goes on that, you know, it occurs prior to self-conscious cognitive reflection, which is the kind of reasoning he's talking about. Because when Hume says reasoning, he's really talking about deductive reasoning, you know, and what counts for reasoning is deductive reasoning, because induction is based upon this instinctive belief in cause and effect, and therefore induction is not really rational. And philosophers of science today are still arguing about this, whether that's true or not. But but he's essentially associating reason with deduction, and I'm wondering if Hegel is saying no, there is something like he's bucking the tradition, probably all the way back to, I don't know, maybe the Greeks weren't quite so black and white about this, but certainly Hume and Kant, and saying that there is a kind of instinctive aspect to reason. Anyway, that's because at first I was like, what the hell is he talking about, the instinct of reason? And that's the only way I could kind of make sense of it.
Nevitt, I when you said that, it reminded me on page 55, Hegel wrote, "Knowing and truth come before consciousness," and I think that gets at what you were saying about your sense of Hegel's rejection of Humean rationality.
So I was going to say, Nevin, I think I disagree with you in terms of what Hegel means by the phrase instinctive reason, but everything that you described, I think you're right. Like, I think Hegel is kind of pushing back against, possibly Hume here, and showing an underlying reason behind instinct, right? That helps constitute, makes instinct what it specifically is, instead of any of a whole array of other things, right? That there's the reason can explain the specific form that animal instinct takes, right? But what I took Hegel to mean when he uses the phrase the instinctive reason, in my reading, and I might be wrong about this, is something. So what you were describing, I would say, is like the reason in instinct, right? But what I take him to mean by the instinct of reason is this initial, like it's like before reason actually gets moving, it arrives on the scene with like certainty, with it's like certain of its knowledge. And I took it as that is the instinct. It hasn't demonstrated its certainty. Reason hasn't gone through the movements to show itself how it knows the world, but it already arrives with this instinct that it will know the world, or it does know the world, although it hasn't yet elaborated how this is so, right? So that's kind of what I took to be the instinct of reason in this reading.
I was typing this into the chat, but I'll just ask you. So, Eric, do you mean that you think that the instinct of reason is kind of like a pre-reflective? This is what I was writing: a pre-reflective confidence in its ability to know the truth, right? Something like that.
Right. Like, what is reason if it's? It's already kind of like it's a way of getting to truth or knowledge, right? And so back to like, in the idea of reason is this notion that you can access truth or knowledge, right? Like, I can't, as soon as reason arrives on the scene, there's something about it that says I can achieve knowledge, or through me, you may attain knowledge of the world,
That makes me wonder, if that's right, that if he's directly addressing Kant also, in that, you know, I've reiterated this several times, and this is based on commentaries, not my own insight, but that, you know, my sense is that both Kant and Hegel see consciousness as, I don't know exactly what the relationship between consciousness and reason are, but that, you know, that consciousness is in some sense essentially rational, but but um, but it appears in these different forms. And so, like for Kant, you know, the understanding is rational, but the understanding can only grasp phenomenal reality. In other words, what you can grasp with your senses. And then Kant says, reason, on the other hand, wants to push beyond that and try to because reason is this desire to know the truth. And so reason tries to push past the understanding and tries to figure out all this metaphysical shit that it really has no way of knowing. And so it invents all this nonsense, this metaphysical nonsense. And then, you know, Hegel, with these commentators that said, is Hegel saying, well, you're right, that understanding has this limited scope of rational understanding, and that reason does want to push beyond that, but reason is actually capable of pushing beyond that. And so what, you know, from what you're saying, it makes it sound like that the instinctive reason maybe is something like that, you know, that, I don't know what to call it, that impulse that reason has to embrace increasingly comprehensive grasp of everything. And Kant thinks that when it does that, it just makes meaningless shit up. Whereas Hegel seems to think, you're right, it has that impulse, but it actually is capable of grasping the truth ultimately.
Right. I think that's accurate. I want to say at one point he does talk about like the confidence of reason early on in the section. I don't remember exactly where, but I want to say he uses the term confidence, right? And just to kind of like, again, like as soon as it arrives on the scene, it's sure it has certainty, right? It just hasn't really demonstrated how, right? So what kind of certainty is it that isn't, you know, I guess that's the first order certainty and the second order certainty, right? Like we do not with knowledge. Do you know this? Okay, now do you know that you know this? Those can be seen as two different questions, right? And so similarly with certainty, right? The instinctive certainty might be that first order certainty without the second order, right? Like reason is certain that it contained knowledge, but only after you've visited Kant and then been through the other side of Kant, can you demonstrate that this instinct is well placed, or this confidence is well placed.
You know, I'm sorry to keep dominating the conversation, but this reminds me of the story that probably a lot of you are familiar with. And I can't remember this mathematician's name, but there was an Indian mathematician, as in East Indian. I guess this would have been in the early 20th century. And he would write these complex mathematical theorems, but he would write them out through intuition. He just kind of had this rational intuition, and he would just write down these crazy complicated theorems that nobody had ever thought of before. And I don't remember exactly, there's a movie about this, but I don't know how this happened, but somehow it ended up, Bertrand Russell ended up discovering that this guy was doing this. And so Bertrand Russell invites this Indian mathematician to England, and Bertrand Russell was just frustrated because this guy doesn't generate proofs. He just writes this stuff down. And then if you, after the fact, you know, if there's this army of mathematicians, academics, after the fact, work through, it turns out he's right, that these sort of mathematical intuitions he has are correct, but he didn't arrive at them through any sort of deductive proof. He had this sort of intuitive grasp that, you know, he just understood. And so I don't know, I mean, that makes me think it's similar, you know, I don't know if maybe it's not the same, but maybe it's an analogy. You know, you have the difference between this sort of rational, you know, maybe the Western philosophers would call it rational intuition. He had a very highly developed rational intuition, but it's not until, you know, Bertrand Russell says, it's not till you go back and you do the hard work of walking through the deductive proof that you can show that this is actually true. There's a difference there.
Well, not mathematician, but my reading about Mozart is that literally he composed his compositions, musical compositions, completely in his head, and he hated transcript, because to him was just merely transcription, right? That he had to go through the onerous task of writing down the keys and all the notes and the orchestration. And so when you see his manuscripts, it's like, wait a second, where are the crossouts? You know, I mean, it seems like he had that ability. And how does one, I mean, I can read treble and bass clef, but my God, I couldn't compose anything in my head, you know. And how you know, and for him it was second nature. It was something that he could do that he just didn't understand in a way why other people couldn't do it.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I was just gonna say that I wanted to say something back when Chase was talking about this article that I thought was kind of funny. Because I don't know, it's just so funny to me to think of like Hegel trying to sound smart. Like to me that's absurd. And I know there are people who probably think that, and I get it, I guess. You know, he's being surrounded by all these sort of people who he's trying to impress on some level. But I get much more the sense that he was sort of toiling, you know, that this was a project that was very much like very important to him and significant, and you know, he wanted to do right for himself. Like he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he couldn't do this right and mess up and keep working through it and stuff like that, you know. So it's just funny to me because you know, I'm not necessarily as experienced, you know, in philosophy, and I don't have as many, I think, you know, grounds to go on in terms of like other philosophers and stuff like that, you know. And so I read this and I can just not understand it a lot of the time. But, you know, I just think it's frustrating for me to see people kind of say that, just kind of completely disregard it because of that, you know, and instead of sort of sitting in their confusion or just trusting that whoever wrote this wanted to say something, you know, that maybe if they were trying to sound smart, there was also something else, you know. You don't put the work into something like this just trying to sound smart. There are certainly social factors that make you want to sound smart in addition, and maybe that's part of this. But yeah, so I kind of found that funny. I think that's kind of frustrating from my perspective that so many people kind of want to sort of see people as doing that, or even just kind of like think of intelligence or being smart as this goal that we should all aspire to, you know, when in reality I think it's just it happens from work, you know. It happens from you trying to understand something, and I think, you know, authentically like working towards something. It's not something that I think you can know that you are, you know, until after you've sort of put the work in and worked through something, I guess. I don't know.
I think
Go ahead, Chase.
yeah, one thing I think you could also kind of articulate that as it's not an exclusive disjunction. It's an inclusive disjunction to be able to say that, okay, there's a bunch of social forces basically going around someone's writing. That doesn't mean that the writing is still communicating something beyond those social forces themselves, you know. I think that's a good way to put it, where people understand, where I think that's the problem, is a lot of people want to reduce it to some kind of, you know, contingent social external thing, like trying to sound smart or whatever. And then they don't realize that, okay, that could be true. And, I think it is true that in a lot of these cases, they are trying to write, in this, according to these conventions and whatnot. But then a lot of times they're still, that doesn't mean that they're not still trying to do some kind of serious, genuine thinking. They're trying to work through it by using those conventions, by expressing themselves through those things. But yeah, so the other thing is about the instinctive reason thing. So I thought that was interesting. So one thing that I was thinking was, okay, Hegel doesn't like intuition. That's pretty clear. He does anything that's immediate, like, no, that needs to be mediated, and that's fair enough. But I wonder if the instinctive reason is his way of trying to basically include a kind of intuition without calling it intuition, because he can't be too much like his old roommate Schelling. He's got a So one thing I think a really important background to this is this book is essentially a rewrite. By that, I don't mean it's not original. It's extremely original. But this same kind of book was first really Fichte in The Science of Knowledge first wrote this idea, basically like the subject and the object coming to this knowledge in the system, and then Schelling kind of rewrote that in the system of transcendental idealism, which, by the way, the absolute ends with art, which is interesting. And then Hegel rewrote the same kind of structure of book of this kind of evolution of knowledge of of consciousness to this absolute. And but he had to distinguish himself, of course, from Schelling, and really because I think his insights were distinct from Schelling. And one of the things is this, probably the biggest point I think that Hegel is disagreeing with Schelling about is about intuition. And I think I was going to say immediacy, but I really don't think Schelling necessarily uses that concept of immediate intuition. That's the kind of thing that Hegel has done. Like, for Hegel, you have to work through it. You have to suffer through it. You have to go through the labor of the negative. But then the instinctive reason thing is interesting because it is the kind of intuition, in a sense, clearly. But at the same time, it's connected with something, reason, that he uses as very distinct from intuition. So I thought this point is interesting because, you have to have some kind of element of a kind of sense of something that's pre-reflective beforehand to guide it. He understands that clearly, but it still has to come to this full articulation of itself. And it seems like, it's a really interesting way that he goes about trying to work through that himself. And I think it is something, okay, the instinctive reason thing, it does seem to me kind of like what Nevin and Eric were talking about, that it is this kind of, okay, if you, reason seems to, it seeks the truth, but that seeking, that desire is already, it has an assumption already of a sense that there's something there for it to seek. And I think that's that kind of absolute truth, is that sort of intuition of it. And then, so it sort of intuits that absolute truth. And then reason is this kind of way of actually seeking it through this working out of the movement of all these of the concepts and whatnot. But I think that's an interesting dynamic, and I'm curious to see if he keeps going with talking about the instinct of reason, or if he eventually just kind of gets rid of it, and just kind of moves on to something else.
Well,
I'm not
that's what I
sure,
want.
but should be interesting.
That's what I wanted to ask, because in 258, he almost seems to think that, he does seem to say that the instinct of reason is self-consciousness, but that its antithesis is consciousness. And it's like that antithesis is almost what completely like dissociates its desire. Like it's not seeking consciousness, it's seeking self-consciousness, but and he seems to almost suggest that the end, or that death drive, is part of the dialectical relationship with reason and its instinct, and it's that it's self-consciousness. And that's where I get, I wanted to maybe hopefully talk a little bit more, because I'm a little confused as to that dialectical relationship. Because he is, from what I read of it, he almost seems to say that self-conscious, like the instinct of reason, is to be self-conscious, and it seeks other self-consciousness. It doesn't care about consciousness itself. So when it finds consciousness, it's not satiated, but it almost is kind of satiated when it realizes there's an end to both of those dialectics, or those antitheses.
Yeah, so it seems like, okay, so he says that reason is something where what it intuits is that the knowledge of these objects are itself. But for right now, I think at the beginning of this, of when reason first, comes on the scene, is that it still is this intuition, I don't know what else to call it, that it grasps in this instinctual manner and is kind of led by that instinct, where what it's trying to understand is itself. So I imagine, just in this kind of crude way of, there's objects around me, and reason is this way of trying to understand how the subject is essential to their being and their knowledge, and together. So I think that's where self-consciousness comes in. And then consciousness is that's a really strange concept, I think, for Hegel. I don't quite totally get it, except that I think consciousness is something, okay, so in the actual section, called consciousness, it starts with, immediate sense certainty, perception, understanding, but essentially it's the kind of knowing or truth claim that has knowledge being some kind of external object, usually.
Yeah.
So it's still kind of stuck in this way of thinking of, I'm not involved in it, the self isn't involved, these are just things out there, I just need to know the thing. That's kind of this consciousness. And then self-consciousness is where the object of knowledge suddenly becomes the self. So that the self trying to seek the knowledge is also in some way the object of the knowledge itself. And I think that's also the reason, is what is the kind of movement that gets to that endpoint where the self actually comes to self-conscious knowledge of itself, so that all the otherness and the external things are suddenly realized in the sense of, this is actually self-knowledge, but in a sense of the self that's very expanded beyond any kind of finite determinate understanding of the self. I'm probably sounding too much like Hegel now, and did that make any sense? I don't know.
Yeah, I
Probably
thought
not.
so. But I mean, I thought I thought what Hegel was trying to work through in part was that obviously reason is helpful in understanding the world, reality, whatever word you want to use, but it was insufficient. It was incomplete. It couldn't understand everything, especially when it comes, because when you remember he brought up organic, how many times has he brought up organic life? And if he's working his way towards human beings in a route, I mean, obviously human life cannot be totally understood or experienced solely through reason by itself. And that's what I was getting at in these couple of sections.
So I think that's definitely true as far as these sections, in that it's still, okay, reason, and even, the kind of longer trajectory of the book, I don't know, call it consciousness, is kind of working through these things, but it's continuously coming short of that absolute knowledge. And I think here, the specific forms of reason that he talks about does fall short of that knowledge, but it makes progress in the same way. Okay, so there's similarities, and I think I remember Hegel only referencing this kind of explicitly once, but there's a kind of formal similarity between the way that some of the movements and understanding kind of work, and then also the way that the later movements also, there's a kind of resonance between some of the parts of understanding and okay, actually, I'm not going to get into that. That's a little ways off, but there's always something that's not going to work, but there's always some kind of way that, okay, even these, these forms of trying to understand, like the understanding that tries to see things as finite and static, and it's still doing something different than what was previously. So the trying to understand something in this immediate sense certainty thing, by pointing at stuff and saying this, there's something there, okay. And then understanding this kind of static way of trying to differentiate things into static concepts, like this diagram of Kant's critique of pure reason I have. See there, all the categories? That's the understanding.
Did you make that?
No, I did not, no. I got it. Actually, it has the person's name, Andrew Stevenson. And I can
Could you put it in the the Slack? That'd be really cool. Could you put it in the Slack, like the Hegel resources? That'd be really cool to see.
Yeah, so finish my point. Okay, so basically reason is definitely making some kind of progress, yet it's always here, it's definitely falling short. Although I believe reason ultimately does grasp the absolute. I think that's kind of the he doesn't want to use the word faculty, and I think I know that's wrong to say faculty, but if reason is the faculty of knowledge, that I think that's what Hegel says ultimately does grasp absolute knowledge, or the true, the capital T. But yeah, in this case here, yeah, it's going to come short. But then there's always the interpretation that, he doesn't really grasp absolute knowledge except in this kind of, Socratic knowledge way. But yeah.
I was just going to throw this out there right at the end, Chase. I'm starting to think of the absolute not as something that is grasped, but as something that obtains in the grasping itself. for what that's worth, right? It's not an object of, it's not absolute, is not the objective truth that none of us can, until we've studied Hegel, attain to, but rather like a form of reason which also includes all of the previous moments as moments of truth. Does that make sense?
I can't remember if he says consciousness is reason or self-consciousness is reason, but what seems to be the case for me, let's see, this is on page 137 at section 233. Reason is the certainty which consciousness has of being all reality. And then he starts talking about different kinds of idealism. And so it seems to me that he's, again, operating from a basic claim that Kant would accept, is that consciousness is fundamentally rational, but that, so it's, it's not like a big distinction between consciousness and reason, but that reason, I don't know how to say this, manifests differently in different domains. So for example, the understanding where reason is the grasp of phenomenal reality is a limited mode of reason. And there are, I think, something like that. So there's different modes of rational comprehension. And the most expansive then is, like, I think like Chase was saying, is absolute knowing, where you put, where through this grasping of the dialectical nature of things, you eventually are able to comprehend in some sense, and I don't know in what sense, kind of the totality. But I think it's all operations of reason. Although that one bit of text that maybe challenges that is that passage that Ed or someone read earlier in section 275, where he talks about nature's irrational playing up and down the scale of contingent magnitudes. But maybe that's related to the question that, I fear I will never understand, but the relationship between consciousness and nature, or what is nature. And it could be, one of the things I'm trying to, or that I've never understood is, what exactly is idealism for Hegel, because he calls himself an idealist. He seems clearly not to be a Berkeleyan idealist, like Berkeley says, there is nothing but minds and ideas, and that's it. And, so we are all these non-material souls, and God just kind of squirts these images into our minds, and there is no book. There's just the idea of the book in my mind that God puts there, but there is nothing other than consciousness. And the strange thing is, Hegel seems to, he says things like that, like reason is the certainty which consciousness has of being all reality, but he seems to not want to be a Berkeleyan idealist. And so I don't, I'm wondering if nature has something to do with that somehow nature is somehow, I'm not sure what to say, different from consciousness, or is like the dialectical opposite of consciousness. I don't know what to say, but I don't understand what, and maybe, again, maybe, we have to get to the end of the book to find out. I don't know, but I just don't, I've never understood what kind of idealist Hegel actually is.
Well, when you were talking, Nevitt, about, and the quote, the what I quoted from was page 161, paragraph 275. And you remember he's talking about organic, I shouldn't say talking, he's writing about organic, right? Of the centers being consistent there, existing complete indifference to each other, freedom of nature unbounded from the concept. If I can use a very mundane example, I'm sure you've heard that cats don't like water. Right? They don't like to be in water. They stay away from it. Well, Chuck Jones, who was an animator, helped give us Bugs Bunny, actually had a family cat who loved to swim in the ocean. And it's that specificity, right? Yes, maybe 999 out of 1,000 cats don't like water, but that crazy, insane feline liked swimming in the ocean. And I think what begging your pardon, Hegel is saying is there is an individuality in organic entities that no matter how far we can say that there are certain characteristics of them, there's going to be a wild card, there's going to be a joker, there's going to be an outlier, whatever kind of terms that we can think of to talk about not the norm. And that we have to take that into consideration if we're going to understand organic reality.
So one thing that
I'm on mute again. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt. Go ahead. I was on mute.
So, Nevin, about the idealism, I was reading in the Hegel dictionary, very convenient, and I read a little bit of the article on idealism, and so it differentiates, of course, Hegel from, Berkeley, and also Kant, which Hegel says that both of those are subjective idealism, even though Kant thought that Berkeley was subjective idealist, but he was, of course, a transcendental idealist. But the thing is, okay, so absolute idealism, okay, so transcendental idealism says basically, okay, what objects are always mediated by the mind. They're always, all appearances are appearances because they're, this kind of real, they're projections, but they're real projections or forms that the mind takes. And Hegel instead says, okay, so in here, what it said, I didn't quite get exactly what it was saying, but one thing I think, especially because you're asking about nature and how that connects, seems to basically be trying to respond to that exact thing. So it says that, okay, it's not that necessarily that matter is just this thing that's posited by the mind, but matter itself is a thought. Matter itself is something that is this kind of indeterminate universal concept of something. But he says even then, okay, so what about the sensible world? What about nature? Okay, I'm just gonna quote this. So this means not that matter is simply read into the sensible world by me or us, but that it belongs to an impersonal system of thoughts that constitute the core both of the mind and of nature. Idealism now refers to the mind, but it suggests that the world is mind-like rather than it is mind-dependent. So there is this kind of objective structure that it goes beyond my own subjective mind in this kind of Kantian way. But the thing is that there's a kind of essential congruence of my thought and the concepts of thought and those things out there in the world or whatever you want to call it. So I think that's kind of what he's saying, that nature is mind-like in the same way that mind is like nature, that there's a kind of profound being of them in the same sense. And I think that's what his idealism is kind of trying to get at. So that, yeah, it's definitely, it's not the Kantian thing, it's not Berkeley, but instead there's this structure of reality that thought can grasp, and that grasping is a kind of univocal being. Sorry to use Deleuzian terms or whatnot, but univocal in the sense of it's said in one voice. That one voice is, the reasonable articulation of thought itself. Does that make any sense? I noticed that, okay, since I've been reading Hegel, okay, first of all, almost everything, I can't stop saying the word determinate. And also I'm constantly using reflexive pronouns that add nothing to it. Because say itself, like what is, yeah, okay. So yeah.
I was going to add to what you just mentioned there, Chase, when you said that, I forget how you put it, in terms of the coextension of reason between consciousness and the world, and how this is, Hegel explicitly distancing himself from Kant. I think that's true, but I want to say, actually, you can find in a close reading of Kant something like a mistake, right? Kant's been accused of equivocating on that term object. Okay, I'll just cut to the chase here. In one section of in one part of the Critique of Pure Reason, objects are given to us in intuition, and then most of the rest of the Critique of Pure Reason, objects are constituted, right, by the understanding. And these are two different senses of object. But if we take it literally, right, if we just say, well, objects are on the one hand given to us in intuition, and on the other hand constituted, and it's the same object. If you take Kant's mistake as like an unintentional discovery, right? I think that takes us close to where Hegel is. Honestly, I'm starting to see that, something of this section, the early part of the section that we read today, something of the logic, the greater logic, as showing how the table of categories that Kant basically put up is like, this is how subjectivity grasps objects, right? By recourse to these 12 categories. Hegel wants to say, yeah, and it can do so. It is able to grasp objects by recourse to these categories, because these categories not only govern consciousness, but they also govern being. And so it's because it's the same categories, it's the same logic, it's the same reason that shoots through our consciousness, that also shoots through our being, that it's possible that we can know things, ultimately, all of them in themselves, so to speak.
I just, I guess, I don't know if, I'm putting my hand down virtually. I don't know if I have some thoughts on the matter, and I don't know if you guys might think that it's, totally idiosyncratic or something, but I do have textual support from this day's reading, actually, for all the points I want to make. So
I don't think anybody could accuse you of being idiosyncratic, Hunter.
yeah, I'm really straight and narrow. I'm a pretty normal guy. I feel that's one of my most identifying features, is that I'm really normal. I pride myself on that.
No, I think it's endearing. I do.
Yeah, thank you. So, hey, if anything endearing, that's a compliment. I'll take it. So okay, here's my point. So let's just start from the beginning. I'm going to try and speed run this idea. Kant is skeptical of our access to the in itself. That's where we're starting, right? Okay, he defines this split between the noumenal and the phenomenal. So what is exempt? And now this is, Eric, this is where I thought you were going to go with where I think Kant but I hadn't heard the critique of his equivocation of the word of an object before. But another critique that I heard was that Hegel critiques Kant for this point here, is that Kant is skeptical of our access to the in itself, but what is exempt from skepticism is this very real split between the noumenal and the phenomenal. And in a sense here, Kant cheats in a way by exempting this one pivotal part of his system from skepticism. And Hegel interprets this in a particular way. And it's that there's a weird area in Kant's philosophy that is kind of underpinning the whole thing, and that's the idea of freedom. Freedom is like the underpinning of Kant's whole system, but he talks about freedom in a very strange way, to where it's like the tension is not between, okay, Kant talks about duty and freedom, right? The tension for Hegel in Kant is not split between the idea or illusion of duty, right? Like, I'm fooling myself into thinking that I'm acting dutifully. I am just, convincing myself that I'm being a dutiful moral subject. It's not the split, it's not the tension between the idea or illusion of duty and a secret pathology. That's where a lot of people critique Kant, is like, well, how am I supposed to ever know if I am actually acting dutifully or freely, or dutifully, or being controlled by some sort of secret pathology? But I think Hegel is making the point. He's like, Kant responds to that pretty well. Like, Kant is pretty aware that like secret pathologies are a big part of the situation that a subject finds itself in, where it analyzes its own experience and thoughts and purposes and decisions, to where it can delineate between its secret pathological or overt pathological motivations versus its dutiful obligations or whatever. So for Hegel, the tension is not, and I'm sorry, this is kind of complex, but the tension is not between the illusion of duty and secret pathology, but like the opposite. Hegel kind of tries to take it into say it's the opposite tension, where it's the idea that we could actually be free is, for Hegel, it's like that's what scares Kant the most, is the idea that we might actually be doing something totally freely and not oriented around some secret pathology. And yes, Chase, I'm just trying to sound smart. Because at the end of the day, I can infinitely pathologize my actions. I am a series of brain chemicals. I am a neurobiological apparatus as a correlate of my actions and decisions and freedoms or whatever, right? Hegel tries to take it one step further and say we can't necessarily, and this is a thing I know you guys might like. Kant talks about schematizing, and I don't know if like this is just basic intro to Kant. Schematizing is schema are the mechanisms in Kant by which we take in our reality and integrate it into our symbolic and phenomenal experience. We take in the mass of data in the sensuous manifold and we schematize it. We give it some sort of structure, and then he elaborates on where that schematizing goes through his examples of the categories, right? But Hegel's making a point that it's like, and these are just like thoughts I'm having, that it's like we can't schematize a free act. The idea, maybe we're not free. Maybe we're ultimately not free, and Nevitt's going to club me with determinism again, like he has for years. I'm just kidding. We can't schematize even a theoretically free act, so we pathologize it. We pathologize the very idea of being potentially free, just as from the get-go. And the point is not that we are self-transparent when we're free. Like, I act freely and I am totally aware that I'm free and it's not pathological and you're all just kidding yourselves. The point is that the impenetrability of the in itself for Kant that we just talked about, Kant marks out this impenetrable in itself. The thing in itself is impenetrable, right? But the move, I think, in Hegel is that we find this impenetrability of the in itself, right? We find that impenetrability of the in itself in the heart of the self, which I know is just a reflective pronoun or whatever. But the point being that, like, the end of this line of reasoning for Hegel is absolute knowing, and we all kind of know that because we read the table of contents at the beginning of the book, right? So absolute knowing, at least in a way that I've heard it described, and this is kind of like a big underpinning of where I'm coming from with this idea here, is that absolute knowing is not it's not the abolishment of ignorance. And I think we've made that point already. I don't think, and nobody's saying that it is that. And I'm just saying I'm in agreement with everybody here. Absolute knowing is not the absolute abolition of ignorance. It's just the total internalization of that ignorance, where the absolute knowing that we talk about or that we try to achieve is just the articulation of the immanent externality of thinking itself. And in that, like, okay, to try and make that make some sense. I guess a different way to say that would be like the search for the in itself that Kant sets us on, outside of phenomena, right? The in itself is supposed to be outside of phenomena. The search for the in itself outside of phenomena leads ultimately back to pure phenomena. And a good example of this would be something that I learned about Deleuze when I was in the Deleuze and Guattari quarantine collective server doing a reading group just last Wednesday, or I guess 2 days ago. And we talked about this thing in Deleuze called the Inhuman View. Chase is I don't know, he might have more to say on this, but like the idea of the Inhuman View is, and this is a quote from Deleuze is, this inhuman view is a view that can be taken by a subject wherein one positions oneself as schematizing or interpolating all of the data in front of it in a way that is homologous to the way things were before consciousness. And Deleuze is saying this all kind of hypothetically. He's like, we do this a lot. We try how many times a day? And this is Deleuze's point kind of, is like, how many times a day do you talk to people about like ideas and concepts and shit? And then they are like, oh yeah, well, what if there were no humans and it was just rocks and deer and like birds and stuff? Would that still go? And Deleuze is like, okay, what you're doing there when you do that is you're trying to take up this inhuman view of reality. And I very much value Deleuze's notion of this inhuman view, because the further point is that like this inhuman view that we try to take up attempts to subtract the opposition between the phenomenal and the noumenal. And in this inhuman view, the notion of the in itself becomes an impossible phenomenon. It's still this thing within our experience and within consciousness, but it's just relegated to this position of being impossible. So Deleuze's point is like, the inhuman view does not give us access to the thing in itself, but we like to think that it does. And when we like to think that it does, we're thinking. And when we're thinking about phenomena. And when we're thinking about this in itself, in our phenomenal thought, it is thus a pure phenomena. So like, as we seek this okay, we'll talk about transcendentalism for a second. The Transcendental Circle, this is a term that people throw around a lot. The Transcendental Circle is like when I seek the transcendent in itself, like the things that make things transcendent, the transcendent elements of reality or experience or being or whatever, the transcendent in itself of any category you want to talk about transcending. We talk about the transcendental in itself, and this transcendent in itself falls back into what is transcendentally constituted. This is what Deleuze is talking about, and this has been like a big gag among idealist philosophy for hundreds of years at the time that Deleuze is writing about this. And he's like, that's the Transcendental Circle. People say the phrase the Transcendental Circle, and that is what the Transcendental Circle is our search for the transcendental ultimately leads us back into what is transcendentally constituted all the time, every time. And every in itself is always already caught in what is transcendentally constituted. And this transcendentally constituted materia is interrupted. And this is where I think Zizek borrows, like Zizek and the Hegelians and all those guys, they borrow a lot from Deleuze in terms of his notion of the cracked and the broken. And Deleuze makes the point that like this transcendentally constituted reality is interrupted by cuts that separate spheres of the transcendentally constituted. And this is why every ontology ultimately collapses. Every attempt at a consistent ontology about this transcendentally constituted material ultimately collapses, and all we have left is like an indelible failure. Okay, so some people would say that this is a very anti-Hegelian point, but this is what I've been leading up to. Okay, so the basic points that I want to get across here is that it's not that we become self-transparent at any point in our moving and our shaking and our reasoning. It's just that we find the inaccessibility of the in itself within ourselves. I think that's a huge point that Hegel is trying to insist upon. And I think that some people would say that, oh, he's trying to overcome Hegel's in itself or Kant's in itself by saying that reason can worm its way into the in itself through a couple of sneaky maneuvers that Kant just was too stupid to figure out. But Hegel is not like that dismissive, I guess, of Kant. and Eric, you were making this point earlier. It's not that he's like overcoming the gap between the in itself necessarily. It's that like, and in fact, there's a point. I'm just now learning this new habit in my note taking where I'm writing down the page numbers of parts of my notes so that I can actually talk about it without sounding like I'm making things up. But I swear to God, I swear to whatever higher power there is, that there's a section, right? He talks about observing consciousness and then describing movement and stability and then essentiality and inessentiality. And then there's a part in the reading that we had today, relatively close to the beginning, where he says that things separate from others for themselves. In their being for themselves, they separate from others, okay? The subjective interpolation of the thing is its being for itself, which ultimately is also its being in itself, which is why Hegel keeps on saying, oh, well, you see this difference. It is no difference at all, haha, which sounds like, you know, but I want to point back to what Chase said about the mind-like versus mind-dependent thing. But the point here is that Hegel makes a point. He says, okay, so you have this contest in things, and this is, I got thinking about this because Nevitt asked, what's the difference between being for itself versus being in itself of like a thing? And we gave some kind of half answers in the Discord, or we attempted to. But so Hegel talks about it right here. He says, motionless being butts up against relative being in the thing. It's the same old story that we had from the perception, where it was the being in itself versus the being for itself. It's self-sufficiency versus its relativity, its necessary relativity, and all of its determinate properties being found in its for others, but also being constituted by what is already present in itself. He's not saying like the point is, it's just a big tangled up web. It's just a big tangled up mess. And what we find is that the thing itself, not in itself, but the thing itself, both in itself and for itself, basically, the thing itself is not consistent. And this two-sided thing that reason is trying to reapproach, which it met in perception of in itself and for itself, it reapproaches it, and it sees that the two sides come undone, and it all just kind of falls apart. And then he keeps belaboring the overcoming and the overdetermining and the failures of reason as it tries to figure out what to do with this mess of web that has come undone. So the thing that I think is important there, the reason I bring that up, is that consciousness approaching the thing and seeing it as not consistent and coming undone, does that not at all, I mean, it does to me, read as his like paying like respects and due diligence to the maintenance and preservation of Kant's impenetrability of the in itself. All right, that's not necessarily saying that he's locating it in the self at that statement, but he is saying right there, he's preserving the impenetrability of Kant's in itself. He's saying we're not totally making sense of it in a complete and holistic way that abolishes ignorance. It's still inconsistent and it comes undone all the time when we try and work with it. So back to the very beginning, I like at the very, very, very beginning of the reading, which is page 136 and like 37 and 38, So in those passages, there's some passages, he first off says that like consciousness separates its being for itself and its being in itself and whatever, you know, he's talking about reflective relations between unchangeability and individuality, but that's the boring part. That's the beginning. The interesting part is where he says, thinking itself is a part of actuality. And this is where I think I'm totally in line with what Chase and Eric were saying, is like thinking, for Hegel, thinking itself is a part of actuality. Consciousness conducts itself here when it recognizes that it's a part of actuality. It's kind of like what's the movie Overboard with Kurt Russell?
Goldie Hawn.
And Goldie Hawn, that's the
yeah, it's a good one.
It was right here, and you pulled it out of me. Thank you. So Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell and Overboard. There's like this scene or this moment where Goldie Hawn is this rich, how Zizek would say it, is she's a rich bitch who lives on this privileged life and lives, with her rich family and spends all her time on this yacht. And then her maniacal, conniving husband tries to kill her by pushing her off the yacht. She falls into the water, almost drowns, gets amnesia, washes ashore. Kurt Russell is this country bumpkin carpenter who finds her and is like, I love you. You're pretty, and do you want to, be the mother to my 2 children? And she's like, oh, you're so sweet, and they fall in love, right? But then at a certain point, Goldie Hawn is by a series of mishaps and coincidences reintroduced to the space of the erudite and the aristocrat. All right. She is, I forget what the circumstances was. I think she was either outside somewhere or they had to work for their family or something, but she comes back into contact with the people from her family, or maybe they find her, I think, and say that she's been kidnapped or whatever. But here, consciousness conducts itself here as in a sort of idealism because it recognizes that thinking itself is a part of actuality. It's like Goldie Hawn recognizing that she is a part of the aristocratic class and then conducting herself in a sort of total identity with it and totally be like, oh my God, Kurt Russell's evil. He abducted me. Oh, Jesus, what have I been doing? This horrible country bumpkin carpenter man was just abusing me for so long. But then, of course, Kurt Russell comes back and says, I love you, and she says, oh, I actually love him. I'm going to leave my aristocratic life behind, right? Okay, so the point of all this is that it's like thinking being a part of actuality and recognizing itself as a part of actuality and feeling like it's in the club. And this is what Hegel is critiquing, is that idealism, this simple idealism, like Berkeley or whatever. I don't want to say simple because it's very complex, but I mean like this absolute, well, actually, I guess Hegel's an absolute idealist, but I mean like, you know what I mean.
Subjective idealism.
Oh, subjective idealism. Yes. So it is certain, in this place of idealism, consciousness is certain of a stable universe and of itself as truth. And consciousness gives reality, stability, and presence to the world. And this is a part, kind of a previous point that I've made before, that Hegel's idea is not that the world is this complete thing and we are approaching it with our finite, limited, shitty perspective and our limited human tools that are just barely able to scratch the surface of this beautiful world. It's that the world itself is this incomplete mess, and our perception gives it reality, stability, and presence. It completes it. Our perception is what completes it. Not directly in our experience do we have a complete understanding or whatever of the thing, but we, at least conceptually, complete it as an in itself. As being in itself. We conjure the notion of it being in itself. So the in itself is only, okay, there's actually a part also where he's talking about the being in itself of reason. The in itself is only insofar as it is for consciousness. Oh my God, holy crap, he said it. He did, like, I just feel like that's like a gun went off when he said that. It was like, so the being in itself of reason is the absolute concept. And the absolute concept is like its having come to be, or its development and all of its shapes and the shapes of consciousness or whatever. But in recognizing its having come to be, one's consciousness is determined to be a part of the shape of the world soul, i.e., the for itself depends on what it already is in itself. So the point is that there's a point here that's also kind of self-contradictory, that the in itself only is insofar as it is for consciousness. But at the same time, the for itself depends on what it already is in itself. Consciousness has to posit a retroactively pre-existing term that had to come before it. Consciousness is the only way that it can do that. The whole point here, I guess, is that it's like science and logic and math and stuff. Necessity, and this is when he's talking about necessity later on. Necessity appears at the end as what was there from the start. And this is where I think, Nevitt, you were making some connections to Aristotle. This made me think of like Aristotle's old famous thing of like a sea battle will happen tomorrow, and that is either true or false. And it is already like that, it's already true or false. It's already kind of certain in some sense what's going to happen, you know? And Hegel would say, what's happening there when you say a sea battle is going to happen tomorrow, and it's either true or false, right? Is that you are taking necessity as this thing that appears at the end. Once the sea battle is over, we look back and we say, oh, of course it was going to happen. It had to have. Or if it didn't happen, we would say, oh, of course it didn't happen. It couldn't have. Necessity appears at the end as what was there from the start, and reason has itself as an end and is thus in and for itself. I think that magic, I think that logic, I combined math and logic and said magic. Yeah, oh shit, maybe I'm onto something. No, math and logic and things like this are these retroactively created terms. And this is back to the instinctive reason. Instinct, I think, for Hegel is like this thing that we retroactively posit as this fundamental basis for our experience. And I think that Hegel's notion of instincts is that it's not necessarily like we are these monkeys that really just want to club each other like mates and drag them back to our cave and have sex with them. But instead, now we live in this stupid society where I have to wear perfume and write bullshit letters all the time and really romance them. And it's really annoying. Like, I think he's not saying that. I think that would be the simplistic view of instincts. I think that what he's saying is that all of our understandings of our instincts are, it's not like if I look into myself and I say, what are my animal instincts? They're not really my animal instincts. They are my concept of animal instincts as I interpret them. And Freud took this one step further by saying that the id and the libido is the retroactively created nature that is always already culturalized, you know? And so I guess my point is not that Hegel is saying like, yeah, it's all weird and confusing, but it seems to be this way. And I'm only going to deal with like how it seems. I think the point that I'm trying to make about Hegel's idealism through this whole thing is that as we seek the in itself, we constantly return to pure phenomena, right? As we try to break out of phenomena, we get caught in the transcendental circle again and again and again. And it's not that we can directly access the in itself. We can't do that. Kant knew that. And Hegel is not trying to fight him on that. And he's not trying to join the other idealists that he's kind of lampooning or talking about here at the beginning of the text that we read today. He's not, you know, capitulating to that line of thinking. It's rather that the impenetrability of the in itself, right, is and this is twofold, and this is weird. This is where it gets kind of complex. The impenetrability of the in itself is the impenetrability of the self in relating to its concepts. And I think the big point there is that all we have are concepts. All we have to work with are concepts if we're going to be reasonable beings. All we have are concepts. I can never totally guarantee that you exist or any of you are not weird illusions or phantasms. And this is why I think Hegel's saying like all the self has is itself, certainly, you know. He's trying to give like Hume and Descartes and Kant, these people that he radically disagrees with, he's trying to give them their due diligence, right? So on one hand, the in itself, on one hand, the in itself, the inaccessibility of that in itself is the inaccessibility of the self, all right, expressing itself in the concept of the in itself. He says it's a very valuable concept and it's useful and it is a problem for thought. And it's all for just thought, you know, I don't want to just hand wave and say it's all just conceptual bullshit, but like, we have to admit that it does arise as a pure phenomenon. And he says, okay, so if we can admit that to ourselves, the other thing that we have to admit is that the being in itself of these things, if we can even theorize it, for us to arise as a subjectivity, it has to be fundamentally incomplete or cracked or broken, and the sight of that crack and that break in the thing that keeps fucking everything up for Hegel, the bad child for him is subjectivity. And so in that way, there's a dual aspect here. On one hand, being in itself only is for us, okay? On the other hand, we only are as a result of the impenetrability of the in itself. And he says, this is where you get this vanishing of extremes, this Mobius, this inside inverted eight, which is another term for that, is the Mobius strip, this oscillatability of concepts, this existence in the middle as the mediating term. And what you have there, and this reminds me of Kierkegaard, is the self in the center as the midway between the beginning and the end. And the beginning is what we retroactively create, and the end is just as impenetrable as is the past. You know, there's this dual impenetrability of a world that is incomprehensible and a subject that is incoherent, I think. And in that way, and in that way only, I think, I would say that Hegel would argue that there is an absolute identity between thought and being. And that's how I think he's an idealist.
So I had to feed a bunch of foxes in the middle of that, so I was only able to pay attention in fits and starts and whatnot. But I'm curious.
Anybody else think that's like one of the best statements? I had to go feed foxes. I think that's amazing. I'm sorry. I think that's great.
Thank you for appreciating that. Yeah, I don't feel like the fact that I had to feed foxes for a week straight too, and deer. I had to, yeah, and all these. Yeah, that's my chore here. Is I have to feed foxes, specifically this mom fox, and I have to feed deer every day. Yeah, it's actually kind of stressful. I'm kind of tired of it, to be honest. I think they should just like run around and feed themselves personally. But anyways, okay. So one thing that I think is interesting about Hegel's idea of idealism. Okay, I remember in the Ulysses we were talking about kind of the joke that there's a materialist Hegel, and because he's an idealist, you know, and those are opposed to each other. But then I think, so I thought about it some more. Then reading Hegel, he kind of goes into this where he says basically materialism is a kind of idealism, which I don't think he's necessarily saying that, you know, that's the thing, you know, materialism all the way because it's an idealism. I don't think that's his idealism, sorry. But I wonder if what everyone thinks of this, his argument that materialism, in the sense that you know, you've got Daniel Dennett, and he's you know, what is real is just brain events that can be, you know, quantified and measured and observed empirically, and consciousness is just nothing. It's an illusion. But that in itself, isn't that strange that these things are totally conceptual, those ideas? You know, even just the idea of a quantity, measurement, all these things are not only things that we experience, which clearly seems to involve some kind of consciousness or whatnot, but that there's just this, you know, really a kind of disregard of critical philosophy in the Kantian sense of, oh, it's this simple immediate accessibility of of material reality, and that's what it is. And they don't acknowledge that itself is, these are concepts and thoughts and whatnot that have to be articulated. That how can, if materialism in that sense, that Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins sense, is true, isn't that extremely strange that we can think that truth, that we can conceptualize that truth and then know it just right there, So it seems to me like this has to be true, that materialism articulated in that way is a form of idealism, in the sense that, okay, it usually comes down to, well, of course, scientific materialism is true, and we know that because of math. But, well, where does math come into this? Where's what is the ontology of math? Like, oh, well, it's just there, like I've argued with people on this point before, and they can never articulate really what's going on with that. Reality's math, and science knows math, so science equals reality. And it's like, okay, well, where does the math fit into the material reality? How do those work? It seems like you have to have some kind of, really a kind of Platonic kind of realism or something to really get that to work, and it's never articulated, because I think these are the same people that are too stupid to be able to read Hegel, so they think it's, oh, this is just, stupid. I don't know, I'm just gonna look at this article on scientificamerican.com and, oh, it's saying something about black holes. That's real. That's real right there, because it's saying it on the article. Okay, I think I'm done talking.
I think we should kidnap Daniel Dennett and putting him in a room and force him to read Phenomenology of Spirit and the Logic, and then force him to write about it in an intelligible fashion. I think that would be fun.
That would be fun. Yeah.
Why not?
So we're past time. So I have one point of business, but before I do that, I give anybody an opportunity to make last comments if there's something you've been waiting to say.
One's real practical. Jackson, I apologize. He left already. He referenced a movie tomorrow. I don't know what he was talking about. Is there?
So he's only done this once, and Chase and I were the only people that attended. But on Discord,
I'll be there then. I'm sorry.
On Discord, he's, well, at whatever time he said, he's going to play adaptation on the Discord channel. And so it's just a way that anybody who wants to can sit and watch a movie together. And so what Chase and Jackson and I did was sort of write snarky comments on the text channel of Discord while watching the movie, which was kind of fun.
Are you watching it through the computer like it's a Zoom link?
Yeah, except in Zoom, it's on Discord, which is I don't know what to call Discord. It's a social media platform that allows for texting and video. The literature seminar has been running on Discord for, a long time now.
Do I have to register for it? If I wanted to see the film?
I'll send you a link to the Discord channel. And then, so Discord is an application that you have to download onto your computer or onto your phone or whatever. And once you download it, then I can give you the link, and it'll bring you into the Discord for this particular group. It's also, and I don't know if anybody else, probably everybody knows this, but it's also a place where we have been posting resources and where we've been having some conversations about the material. And so it's a, like Zoom is only here as long as we're talking, whereas Discord is kind of a permanent home for information related to the seminars.
Okay, well, thanks. One other thing, I on page 141, I didn't bring it up earlier because it didn't fit into the conversation, but he used the phrase, that something falls into the bad infinite. And I only saw that he used the word bad twice, and this was one of them, up to page 164, wherever we ended. Or like 167 was like bad Latin, but I understand bad Latin, it's a bad translation or whatever. But it never occurred to me that a type of infinite could be bad. And I just thought that was an interesting concept. And if somebody just wants to email me and say, hey, they think that's what he was trying to get at. But
I don't know what it means. I mean, the Discord would also be a good place to say that, unless somebody has a relatively short answer.
Well, so I definitely don't have a short answer for the good infinite, but the bad infinite is kind of numeric, indefinite, just extrapolation of numbers, kind of, it seems like to me. Where, okay, well, good infinite seems to be when an opposite contains itself. It's kind of that unity of opposites, that it's always got something dynamic going on with it, whatever. Okay. So yeah, I don't have a short answer for that one.
I'll harass you in an email.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So one thing I did want to talk about before we go, Nevin, what were the results of the reading length thing? Please tell me that we're going to lower it.
Only 5 people voted, and everybody that voted, and which I didn't vote though, so that's not including me, and everybody that voted wanted to extend it through the 22nd, which would reduce the reading load to 18 pages a week instead of, I don't know what we're at like now, 25 to 30. It seems like it's like more like 30, but I guess that depends. There's some shorter ones later. But so everybody that voted wanted to move it to the 22nd. Hunter made a comment that he wouldn't mind actually extending it all the way to December, but was willing to go with the October one because that's what everybody else asked for. So the people who voted want to extend it to October, and the way I calculated those numbers were based on starting the new schedule on July 9th. So not next week, but the following week, because that would give me a week to rewrite the schedule. So I don't know, does anybody, I know Eric and some others were concerned that's going to make it really difficult to bring new people in. Chase sent me a text. He had an interesting idea that when we finish Hegel, instead of trying to do a new book, I mean, we could just take a break because we're all going to be intellectually exhausted. So one possibility would just not to do anything, from October 22nd forward. Chase suggested the possibility of having some, essays that take a week or two for each one, depending on the length, and just, that would be something we could just like, well, for the next 2 weeks, we're going to read this essay by whoever, and then we could just kind of fill in on an ad hoc basis for the rest of the semester. And I guess we could just wait until we're almost done and in mid-October, and then just decide, do we want to keep meeting for the rest of the semester, or do we all want to go and try to recover our brain function? So I don't know. So does anyone want to express an objection to extending it to October 22nd?
I don't object. I don't really think my brain's ever functional, so there's never any state of downtime or normalcy. So
Well,
yeah, whatever.
reading Hegel is going to make it worse. I can pretty much guarantee you that.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, well, objections aside, I guess we'll extend it to, but next week's reading will still be the one that's on the original schedule. I don't know how many pages it is. And then we'll come up with a new schedule starting July 9th that extends it through October 22nd, which should drop the reading load down to, on the average, 18 pages a week. But that's, going to be highly variable depending on, trying to break it up in reasonable places.
Would you like me to make a reading schedule, just alter the one I made, or do you want to do that?
I would offer to marry you once again if you were willing to do that.
Yeah. So can
But
I
was not going to ask because
twice?
I was not going to ask because that sounds like a terrible burden, but that would be great.
Okay, I think I can do that. So October 22nd, right?
Yeah, starting
Okay,
July
I think
9th.
I can do that.
Can you please include a picture of the foxes?
I have a lot of pictures of foxes. I'll put those on the
think that's
Discord
amazing.
at least. Yeah,
Please. I love that.
will do.
Okay, so that was actually the point of business I wanted to talk about so that's the only other thing I have. So anything else before we adjourn? Okay, Hunter's making weird faces again, so I guess we need to leave.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Stop making your faces, Hunter.